Okay, this is Adobe Flash. It's going to look somewhat similar to Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator and all the other things, but it also is going to look very different. There are a lot of differences in the way that Flash works over how Photoshop works and how Illustrator works. But in essentially, it's basically the same thing. Now, the first thing that you're going to do whenever Flash pops up is it's going to start like this, which I hate. I hate the way it starts up. It starts up in Essentials mode. What you're going to do is, since we're primarily doing animation, you're going to go up here and you're going to highlight this where it says Essentials, okay? And you're going to click on that. You're going to get a drop down, and what you're going to do, since we're doing animation, you're going to choose the animator. Now, once you start getting used to Flash, you can actually make your own workspace. You can edit, duplicate, change the workspaces, and so on and so forth. But we'll just start with animator, and you can see that now it looks a lot different. Whenever Flash opens up, it's going to start with this screen. Usually, you can always turn that off if you don't like it. You can always just go File New if it doesn't show up. But if you just take a look at what we've got here, you see you've got the Create New Files. We're just going to create a brand new ActionScript 3.0 file. So if I scroll in there, you can see that right there. Okay. Click on that. And once I click on that, let's try this again. Click. There we go. It's going to create a new animation for us. Now, essentially, all the pieces are about the same. You'll notice that in the center we have a toolbar here, and you can see you've got a fill color and you've got a stroke color. You've got a lot of tools that should look pretty familiar, except maybe the bone tool, and there are some new tools in there that you're not going to recognize, but you've got your two selection tools, your direct selection tool or just regular selection tool there, and then the sub selection tool, as they call it. But it works a lot like Illustrator, where the black selection tool clicks on whole objects, and the white selection tool clicks on, do you remember specifically it clicks on in Illustrator? Points. It clicks on the corner points, okay, so you can select individual things. Inherently, Flash is a vector-based program. Now, it functions a little bit more like Photoshop in some instances where you can import JPEGs into the mix, and you can make photographs part of your animation. But in a sense, it is basically a vector-based program. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it's a vector-based program. It's not really made to edit photographs. So a lot of times, if you're using photographs in an animation, you'll be bouncing back and forth between Photoshop and Flash a lot. That's just the way it works. So what we're going to do, oh yeah, before I get to that, up top here you're going to see we have a timeline. You see this? This is our timeline. And here you're going to see layers, and we can have multiple layers in an animation. These numbers here, does anybody know what those are? Seconds. That's an excellent guess, but you're not correct. Frames, very good. They are frames. Matt said that. Matt, all right, Matt. Okay, now, so is 5 frames, if I were to click right here, is 5 frames a lot or a little? A little. How many frames go into a second worth of film, just on average? Sometimes, you're right. Never 40. Sometimes 30. There are, now, okay, so here's the real answer is, it depends. There are multiple answers to that question, and there are multiple answers to the question if I were to say, what would you want to set your animation file for? Television is usually set to about 30 frames per second. Some TV shows on cable in high def are set to 60. Okay, but usually not. Usually it's 30. Well, that's another discussion for another time. Which one's better? Neither. There are aesthetic changes that happen. Movies are done at 24 frames per second. Okay? That's the big deal about The Hobbit that just came out, was it was done, it's the first full-length feature film that was ever done in 48 frames per second. And the reason why they're doing that is because it matches your brain functions a little closer, and it makes things look a little sharper, especially in 3D. How many of you have ever gone to a 3D movie and... Titanic. Right, okay. And when things were moving really fast, did you see a flickering effect that happened between two? Okay. The 48 frames per second, because it's a faster frame rate, has a tendency to get rid of that. Now, there are some people who don't like the 48 frames per second because they think it makes it look too real, or they got motion sick from it. There's all sorts of other stuff that's happening. Anybody who went to see it, nobody that I know who went to see it didn't say, or let me reverse that. Everyone I know who went to see it or read said it took about 10 or 15 minutes to get used to because it was so different. I'd never seen anything like it. So the standards are changing. This 24 frames per second, where it comes from, is essentially back in the day, okay, they needed to get by on shooting as many frames per second as they could to make the motion look good, but they wanted as little frames per second as possible so they could make the films, go a little further, so they didn't have to spend as much money on film, because movie film is very expensive. And so 24 frames per second ended up becoming the standard. So now, here's the thing. I hate working in 24 frames per second, even though that's considered the standard for animation in movies. Why do I hate it? You're going to laugh at this. Because the math is hard. Okay? 2 seconds equals 48, right? But then after that, I have to really start thinking about how many frames is in 4 seconds, or how many frames is in 8 seconds, or whatever. So I personally like to work at 30 frames per second. But the important thing here is that you understand, excuse me, that those little numbers up there do not correspond to seconds. They correspond to the number of frames. If you don't know how many frames per second your animation is set for, well, golly gee, it's right here. Flash basically starts at 24 frames per second. So what we're going to do is we're going to change that. Right over here in our properties tray, you can see there's our properties tray. Oh, look at that. Frames per second. I can click on it, and I can just type 30, hit return, done. Now, second thing, I don't know why. I mean, I'm sure there's an answer to this. Why this is the standard or the default for Flash, 550 by 400. I really don't. Does anybody know what standard definition, how many pixels a standard definition video is? Think about YouTube when you see
1,250.
No. Okay, 1080 is high def. That's the top.
720.
720 is also high def. That's the next.
220.
480. Good. So when you got YouTube, you have 1080, then 720, then 480, then 360 is usually next, and then 240 is like the really old videos. Nobody has, uploads 240 anymore. Your iPhones, you can buy an iPhone for $50. You can get it for free that does 720, and the $50 ones do 1080. So I mean, like, everybody's shooting in high def these days. So what we're going to do is we're going to set ours to 480p, which is actually 640 wide and 480 tall. Okay, just for now. We can work in high def later, and we probably will. But for now, we're gonna work in standard, which is 640 by 480. So now you'll see the stage does change a little bit, and we've got a nice rectangular 4x3 animation started. Now, what we're going to do, and this is the first assignment on the sheet, is we're just going to take a rectangle and we're going to move it from left to right. But there's a couple things we need to deal with first. So I'm going to give you a lot of information here. So just pay attention, and this video will be obviously available on YouTube because you're going to need it. I'm going to go over here. There's a simple rectangle tool here, and I'm going to click on it, and I'm just going to draw ourselves just a nice little rectangle. Now, if I zoom in, you can see that our rectangle has a black outline and a green interior. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is this is where Flash starts to depart from Photoshop and Illustrator, and that is the way that it handles shapes. Okay? There are some things that are the same, and there are some things that are obviously very different. So, for instance, if I go and grab the white arrow tool and then grab the corner point of this object, I can stretch it and make a different shape, exactly like I can in Illustrator or Photoshop. I can also go under the pen tool. There's a convert anchor point tool, and I can, you know, change the curve of the lines and again modify the shape. However, you can also royally mess up your objects. Using the black arrow tool, if you're not careful, let's say you just click in the middle and I want to move this thing, right? If I just click in the middle and I move it, look what happens. You can move the fill, the interior of your object, separate from the stroke, the border of the object. You couldn't do that in Photoshop and Illustrator, okay? You can separate them. You can also grab chunks of an object like this, oops, and really mess things up. When you do that, it's interesting what happens is then if I click on it with the white arrow tool, it has a whole new outline. It just makes a whole new object out of it. This is extraordinarily powerful, actually. It really is. It's extraordinarily powerful. But it also can really mess people up. So you have to be very careful. If you want to move an object, you need to highlight the whole thing. So I always click off the object and draw a box around it, and now I can move the object. Or, here's the best thing to do. Right-click on the object, go to the bottom, and convert the object to a symbol. And a symbol is like a container. It's a container that holds the object. We're going to need to do this to make it animate anyway, basically. Okay, so symbols are really powerful. Now I'm going to make a mistake here on purpose. I already made the mistake, so if you're paying attention, you might know what I just did. And I'm going to convert it to symbol, and I'm going to call it rectangle 1. Okay, and the settings are all the default. Movie clip, registration is fine. We'll learn more about that stuff later. There's a whole host of stuff. You can add code to it, because you can actually add code to these things. I mean, it gets pretty complicated, but we're just going to click OK. Now, so here's something interesting. So here, I've got my symbol. And if you look, my properties tray has changed. And if I click on my library over here, you'll see I've got my symbol, and I've got a little preview here of that object. So now let's say I want to move it. Now the mistake that I made is going to become painfully obvious. What did I leave behind? I left the border behind. The mistake that I made actually happened like 4 clicks ago. When I right-clicked on the object, I only clicked on the center, the fill. So let's back up here. And instead of just right-clicking in the middle, I'm going to highlight the whole object here. Now, and it looks a little different. You can even see how it gets like dotted here? That means that the border is selected. If I just click in the middle, can you see how the middle changes colors? Now the middle is selected. If I click the whole thing, now you can see how that looks like the whole thing is selected. This is a huge mistake that everybody makes. So now I'm going to right-click, convert to symbol, rectangular, rectangle 1. We don't need that. Click OK. Now when I move it, oh, look, everything comes along. OK, so here we go. We're going to move this thing. We're going to animate it. Ready? The way we're going to animate it here, this is frame-by-frame animation. This is the slow way. There is actually a faster way to do what I'm going to show you to do today, but I don't want you to do it that way. I want you to learn this because sometimes it becomes the only way you can animate certain specific things, okay? And it will also give you a little bit of a better appreciation for what happens in old hand-drawn movies, okay? Where, you think about this now, 24 frames per second, that's 24 drawings for every second. Can you imagine what it was like to draw Snow White back in the, was it 1930s, okay, and make an hour-and-a-half long movie with 24 drawings every second, and to do it consistently with color and have to coordinate all those different people that had to make that happen and do it in, I don't know how long it took to do Snow White, but a modern movie, hand-drawn modern movie, still takes 3 to 4 years to make, right? Beauty and the Beast, I think, was 5 years in development, even with modern technology. And that was with like 300 people working on it. Right? So, I mean, it's huge. Maybe it was only maybe it was 3 years, but anyway, it still takes years with 300 people to do. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to our timeline here. Okay? We've got 30 frames a second. I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to right-click on 30, and I'm going to insert, well, I'm going to insert a keyframe. A keyframe, notice here, actually, before I do that, notice we've got this little gray square here, and we've got a little black circle. That black circle indicates that there's a keyframe there. That keyframe means that the settings for that object, in this case our rectangle, have been saved on that frame. Its position, its color, its rotation, all those types of things. If I make another, well, let's just go insert frame. Notice that there's no circle there. There's that little rectangle. That just means that it's ending. The animation's gone. So notice if I scrub the timeline, that's what we call this, move the timeline back and forth, nothing changes, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to insert a keyframe, and now I'm going to put the rectangle where I want it to go. I'm going to hold the Shift key down. I'm going to have this thing move in a straight line. So now, if you notice, I've got another little circle there because I right-clicked and said Insert Keyframe, and now it's going to jump. Okay? So basically, the way the timeline reads right now is it reads, this keyframe, those settings right here, exist for frame 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 all the way to 29. And then at 30, the settings change. And it jumps. Well, obviously, we don't want it to just jump, right? We want to make it move. So what do I have to do to make it move?
I'll put it in every spot.
What do you mean? Like, put it in every spot?
Go to every spot.
Make more keyframes, you mean?
Yeah.
And move it for every keyframe? Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. So here's the best way to do it. You could go to frame number 2, make a keyframe, move it a little bit. Frame number 3, make a keyframe, move it a little bit, and keep going with that. The problem with that is you get to 29, and you might be all the way off the page because you moved too far each time, or you might not have moved enough, and then all of a sudden they're going to start speeding up. If you want the speed to be consistent, what you want to do is have half everything. So I'm going to go to 15. And now I'm going to make another mistake on purpose here. So I'm going to move this about halfway. And then I'm going to create a new keyframe. Now let's test it and see what happened. Oh, stink. What happened? What did I do wrong? Anybody guess? I moved the rectangle before I created the new keyframe. So what I actually did is when I moved the rectangle, I was changing this keyframe. So look at this, guys. This is important. If I set the timeline to 15, right, but I don't make a new keyframe, and I move it, I'm changing the settings for this keyframe even though I'm not on that frame. Oh. Big problem, isn't it? So I need to right-click and insert a new keyframe here first. Then I can go move this into the middle, okay, and look. Now I've got the start of an animation. So now what I want to do, again, I want to try and keep my speed consistent, is I'm going to go here into the middle, okay, and I know I can't divide 15 in half, right? And I'm going to insert a keyframe. Now, I actually made a little mistake here, but this is a good lesson too. In the directions I said 60 frames, just roughly 2 seconds. So I made a big mistake. So we're going to drag this keyframe out to the 60. And then I can click on this keyframe and drag it to the 30. And now we're all good. So that's kind of cool. You can drag keyframes around to retime stuff. So now I'm going to go here, make another keyframe for 15. And I'm going to put this at about 25%. Here at 45, insert another keyframe and put it at 75%. Now it's starting to look a lot better, isn't it? So then now half of 15, guess what? It's 7 or 8. Take your pick. So I'm just gonna go 7 right now. Insert another keyframe, and here I'm going to just move it a little bit, and then I'm going to test it out. Boom, boom. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. So now I'm going to go to halfway between 15 and 25, insert another keyframe, and I'm going to move it again about halfway between here and half. See what's happening? By dividing in half every time like this, I'm going to start getting an animation. Eventually, it'll look pretty smooth. Your goal, I'm not going to do the whole thing, so I want to bore you. Your goal is to have a keyframe at least every 2 frames for this animation. What does that mean? Well, even though your animation is running at 30 frames per second, if you have a keyframe at every other frame, how many frames per second is your animation actually really running at? 15, because you're really running 15 frames, okay, every second instead of 30. But that's okay. You'll get the idea. This is super simple. I have students of mine who've worked and still are working in Flash and stuff like that, where they're making guys running and jumping and stuff like that, just like this. Now, I'm going to show you one more trick here, and it's called onion skinning. It's pretty cool. Okay. See if I can remember how to turn it on. It's down here, right? Onion skin. Okay. So right down here at the bottom, there's a little button here called onion skin. You can do outlines or regular. It doesn't really matter in this case, but you can try either one, whichever you like. When I hit it, okay, you see this little thing changes here. It's going to show you in like ghost form the frames in front of and behind your selection. So now as I adjusted that, it's a way of you measuring, see now there's nothing forward there, it's a way of you measuring how much you're jumping ahead. So if I go here and I look, what I should see is that the previous frame here, the distance from here to here is the same as the distance from here to here. See? Jump to the next one. Now I see that the distance, again, the change is from here to here is different than the change from here to here. I did a pretty good job of guessing. With the onion frames, it really makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier. And so once you start getting into the middle here, again, insert a new keyframe. I'm going to then move this so that my distances are all the same here. Maybe about there. See how that works? Now it's looking pretty good. You can turn off onion skinning at any time just by clicking the little button there. and then test your animation. Okay? And as you continue to fill in the middle with more and more steps, okay, the animation is going to get smoother. If you get to the point where you actually fill in every frame with a keyframe, so you get 60 keyframes, okay, in this whole animation, your animation will be running at 30 frames a second, and it will look perfectly smooth when we play it at real time. It's pretty cool. Okay, if you can get to that, that would be great. Does this make sense, at least as far as the overall? You're going to step into this tomorrow, and you're going to your initial reaction is going to be to freak out. Don't freak out. It's different. It's very different, but it's no harder than anything else that you've done so far this year. It just may be something you've never done at all before in any way, shape, or form, whereas you may have played around with pictures or something like that. So you might be thinking, this is totally different. I have no idea what I'm doing. This is going to I'm freaking out already. Don't worry. That's why we're starting like this. Basic and simple. One period, you should be able to get this pretty close to done. Maybe 1.5. Any questions? Okay. That's that.